And without any further ado, it is really my pleasure to welcome tonight's speaker and introduce her. Tonight we are joined by Susan Carpenter, who's coming to us from the University of Wisconsin-Madison Arboretum, where she is the native plant gardener. In this role, Susan works with students and community volunteers to manage and monitor a 4-acre garden, which represents southern Wisconsin's native plant communities. Susan also promotes pollinator and bumblebee conservation through outreach, monitoring, and engaging students and the public in documenting native bumblebees through the Wisconsin DNR's Bumblebee Brigade program. So Susan, warm welcome tonight. Thank you so much for joining us. We're really happy to have you here, and we're looking forward to your program.
Thank you. Thanks, Amy. I'll go ahead and share my screen. Is it there? Got it, Amy?
Yep.
Okay,
Yep,
great.
Yep.
Wonderful. Thank you for this invitation to be part of the winter series. I was at the talk that Rich gave and just really enjoyed that. And I have presented with Karen before and saw her in a webinar yesterday. So I know you're in for a treat next time. I'm going to cover the area between the more large scale restorations that Rich talked about and the more specialized kind of thoughts that you would have for focusing on pollinators. I can't get through, as I was preparing the talk, I know I can't get through a whole talk without saying something specifically about pollinators. So you'll have a slide in there somewhere about that in particular. Turns out that most of the principles and things I'll talk about today do apply to pollinator gardening, and some of them do apply to the larger scale projects that you may have going on at your private land. So I'm going to really focus on the home scale, though, the yard, the garden, the kind of human scale, built environment type scale, suburban, urban, some exurban type gardening, but thinking of it in that way. So some of the principles will, of course, be that scale will really show up how different this gardening could be from, say, more of a restoration approach. So native plant gardening, as most of you know from your own gardens, I'm sure we have people here who are already very accomplished native plant gardeners, and we have people maybe just getting started or kind of wondering, well, what do I do next type of thing. But native plant gardening draws from our native landscapes. That's where it starts. And so there's a lot of things to know about native landscapes that you can bring into an approach to native gardening. And it's often motivated by a particular interest. So I've had people who are interested in prairies, so they want to do a prairie garden. They're interested in butterflies, butterfly gardens, hummingbird gardens. And so a lot of times, or even art and design. So a lot of times people will start from that point and then begin to build out from there into the fullness that this type of gardening really offers. So I just want to say a few things about native plant gardens and native landscapes. So this could be on the small scale or on a little bit larger scale, and it will have some overlap with your restoration ideas as well. These gardens, as they're gotten off the ground and as they're managed, are healthy and diverse. So some of those same principles of land health, biodiversity, at all levels are present here, and that's one of the goals that we would have. They're full of life. So all the living things, when you go from an area that is not a garden, like, so say it's just pretty much a traditional lawn or even a weedy lawn, and you put in native plants, pretty much immediately you're just seeing a lot more forms of life and a lot more activity. They're sustainable. And by sustainable, I mean that they're mostly perennials. They are going to continue over time, not the same over time, but they're going to continue over time with different weather conditions, different site conditions, sort of determining it's back and forth, different management conditions, determining kind of a back and forth, but overall, they're very sustainable. We don't find after years that we're, unless we want to, that we're having to replace plants or put new plants in, unless we choose to do that. They're maintained with low inputs. And by this, I mean inputs like no fertilizer, no herbicide, except in rare cases of a spot treatment you might need to do. I can talk to that example, some examples about later. No, not as much mowing. Obviously, we're not going to be mowing a garden that looks like this compared to a lawn or more, more open area. So the input, those kinds of, no watering. We don't really water our native gardens at all, except for when we first initially are planting. You can still weed though. So that is one thing that you don't have to give up for native plant gardening. And so the myth that you'll put all the plants there and everything's going to take care of itself and nature will care for the garden for you is a little bit untrue. So you can still weed, but you don't have to have all those other inputs. These gardens are of a place. If they're done with the inspiration and the examples of the local flora, they are of the place. We can look at the garden, we can know what region are we in. They're adapted to the climate and the soils of the region because they're drawn from that native flora. They're always changing, and this isn't a bad thing at all. This is the kind of thing where a site becomes more shady over time. A garden, the early species thrive at first, and then they kind of settle down, and and other species kind of become to the fore. Plus, it's always changing over the span of the year and over the span of the seasons, and even sometimes over the span of the day in terms of which insects you'll see, in terms of which flowers will be actively blooming, or other, the way the shade comes to the site. And they're fascinating. So this is one of the most important things I think about native plant gardening. It's in some ways, I mean, all gardeners are fascinated with gardens, but this is a little more fascinating to me in that there's always a question that you have and always something you're seeing and wondering about. And that's just built into this kind of work. So today I just want to touch on these topics. Those of you who've heard me speak before know that I can go on and on and on and on and on. But if there's one thing I want you to remember throughout the talk and for the future, is the most important thing about native plant gardening is to match the sites to the plants, or the plants to the sites. Get a good match. And this is true for restoration. It's true for a lot of things, but this is a very, very important thing. How do you do that? There's ways to start. I'll touch on that, but also there's a lot of resources to bring to that and a lot of observations to bring to that. I will talk on the home garden scale about a few issues that always come up as questions. And these are things that we're always getting requests to talk more about. So things like small spaces, how do you deal with small spaces with these? Some of these plants are just huge and the scale, that sort of scaling. And then how do you, and what are some cues to care? What do we mean by that? And that has to do with how the garden looks and how it's perceived and how it's accepted, not only by ourselves in some cases when we're starting to garden this way, but also how it's accepted by neighbors, by the community, by other people who we hope will join us in gardening in this sustainable way. And then with a lot more heavy rains and rain, more frequent rainfall, more frequent heavy rainfall, which is a result of our changes in the climate. I want to touch on some ideas about rain gardens that you may be familiar with, but it's just such a timely topic right now that I'll touch on that. Biodiversity, even on a small scale of a garden, is quite important. So I'll touch on a few of the aspects of a native plant garden that are not completely obvious when we're just thinking about the plants, plant community, how are we putting these plants in, but what are some of the communities that build out around these plants? And then I'll go through a series of sustainable gardening practices, things that will help the plants thrive, will help the garden thrive, and will help you learn about them. So this is an aerial view of the native plant garden at the Arboretum. It's a 4-acre area here, kind of odd shaped around the Arboretum Visitor Center. And you see Longenecker Garden over here, the neighborhoods close by, the Curtis Prairie here to the left. And so all of these things are kind of coming together at the Arboretum for, they're coming together here at the Arboretum for people to learn and people to make connections between these different locations. So how do the native plant garden at the Arboretum was designed by Daryl Morrison. And it is now, I was just thinking, how old is it? It is now just we're coming into its 20th season of plants going into the ground, which is just, it doesn't seem like it's been that long. But we have had Daryl's involvement all the way through. So it's been very interesting to have the original garden designer involved all the way along, all throughout this time. So how to start? Now, Daryl, I was fortunate in this case because Daryl did a great many designs for this garden and plant lists and so forth. So here is an example on the left here of one of the planting designs for a small area of the garden. And he hand drew these. And so all those little dots and colored areas are individual plants labeled there. And these, I know you can't read anything on here, but you can see there's quite a long list. So quite a bit of diversity, even in this small area, which is probably about, this whole area that you're looking at is probably about a half an acre or maybe 3/4 of an acre altogether. And we have a small building there. So there's the south side of the building here, the north side of the building here. And the other features are paths and different zones of the plants. You can sort of see a feature here where this is a lower area, a very heavy clay soil. And he has this area sunken down slightly. And this is acting as a bit of a rain garden here with the flow of water down from the hillside. And then on the north side of the building are more different plants are planned there, of course, for the different type of habitat that has. So you can start with a design like this. Daryl has a lot of design principles in play in his designs, curvilinear edges, paths that kind of go off around a curve into the distance, giving a little sense of mystery. He has light and shadow. The heights of the plants are varied. And then there are places where you stand. This isn't one of them, but there's places where you can stand or sit in the garden where when you look out, you don't see any of the paths or the lawn. It disappears because of your perspective from where you're sitting. So that's another feature that was built into it. And it's been very interesting along the way. You'd think I would know every nook and cranny, but some of those scenes are not, they're visible at certain times of year and not at others. So it's really quite interesting to move around the garden and see how those design principles come to the fore. But we're not all designers and we're not all able to start in this way. I will point out just on this slide before I move to the next one, that the Wild Ones just in the last couple of weeks has placed on their website some garden designs. So for people who are just getting started. So if you are interested in something like that, that's on a little smaller scale than a 3/4 of an acre, you might take a look at those and see if those appeal to you as a resource. Mostly what I find is people who are wanting to get started or even in the midst of their native plant gardening want to add a few favorite plants or start with a few favorite plants. So they might like the vibrant colors of the cardinal flower against the mountain mint with the Culver's root and the sweet black-eyed Susans, or they might like this more subtle color palette here with the giant purple hyssop and the elm leaf goldenrod. And here's a little hummingbird there. This hyssop is very popular with hummingbirds and bees too, but it's not a classic hummingbird flower, and yet I know that the hummingbirds are very interested in it. And then, of course, sometimes form and shape and late season color is of interest, and so these beautiful short grasses here are appealing. And how can we know if we're doing a good job, or how can we kind of tell, is our garden developing well? I'm taking this this statement here from, I learned it from Chris Helzer, the prairie ecologist, and his blog was quoting a colleague of his who said the way you can evaluate your prairie restoration, and I translate this to gardens too, is you can look for color, movement, and noise. And if it has those three things, you're doing well. And if it doesn't have those three things, then try to get those three things. So the color of the flowers, the color of the tiny solitary bee here, the movement of a butterfly coming down, of a buckeye coming down to a plantain to lay eggs, and of course the sound of a sandhill crane in the fall, kind of looking to migration. These are just some examples from the garden at the Arboretum, but all of us know examples of these. So it's just kind of an interesting way to think about assessing your plantings, whether or not you are doing any other kinds of assessment. So what I mentioned before, and what I would emphasize again and again, is matching the plants to the site. So when we first start with a new site, or with a site that we know well, but we haven't really been looking at it in this way, we want to be sure we're able to match the plants to the site. And the details matter. When Daryl designed the native plant garden, he cited the savanna. I saw the early preliminary drawings of the whole site, and he had the black oak savanna in one place and the bur oak savanna somewhere else. And then in the real plan, the final plan, they were switched. And I was curious about that and realized that what he had done there was he had to kind of set the areas if he wanted them both to be savanna type areas, but he hadn't as yet to that point paid attention to the actual site characteristics of two places that are not 100 yards apart. And one of them is more sandy, and one of them has a heavier soil, a more mesic soil. And so he put the bur oak savanna garden on the more mesic soil and the black oak savanna on the sandier site. He did that again and again with all the different areas in that garden, and it has made gardening the garden much easier proposition, because you're not fighting against the site with the plants that you're trying to get established. So we can ask ourselves, what are the garden areas or the prospective areas like now? Are they shady throughout the day? What's the soil type? What's the slope? What's the aspect? Which way does the slope, if it is a slope, which way does it face? Is there water involved? Will water be coming through the area? Will water be gathering and pooling in the area in the case of heavy rain? So all those kinds of just basic questions. Here in the maple basswood garden at the Arboretum, we had established maple trees. They were there before the garden, established there, and that was where that part of the garden was sited. The soil underneath them was compacted because the parking lot was on this side of the garden and the restrooms were on the other side. So it had been really well traveled for years from the parking lot to the restrooms. And that was the area that was designated to be the maple basswood forest garden. So there was ginger there already. That's a clue that you've got to start. And with the species list that we had, we went ahead with more plantings of the type. So here is just the really early emergence of the maidenhair ferns coming up through the ginger, and many other spring wildflowers were in this area. It took a long time with that compacted soil, just keep on building and building in those plants. So don't think that highly disturbed areas cannot be gardened. Almost this entire area that I have that I've been working on at the Arboretum was either started out or has been a highly disturbed site. So you can still make progress with that. And this was a lawn which was on a filled and graded slope. So it was just plain lawn. And this is the Mesic Prairie Garden now. So this is the classic kind of tall grass representation. And we did remove, we didn't remove in this case, but we did in sections plant the plants into the area. At the time, this was 20 years ago, we sprayed out the turf. If I were to do this again at this time, I would probably use a sod cutter instead and just take the sod off. That's a very effective method for turning lawn into a garden. You don't need to add topsoil or anything else, just sod cutter and then go ahead and plant onto that into that surface. You might have a few taprooted weeds that you'd get rid of later if they became a problem, like dock or something like that. But generally that leaves you a really good open space to work with. An example of that, and a very successful example, would be the entrance to Picnic Point. They have a couple of rain garden areas right there as you go on to Picnic Point through the gate there at the base. And those were done exactly that way, with sod cutter, just run it around the area, plant the plants directly in, and those low areas make wonderful rain gardens. This is a south-facing slope, so it is highly, and it's in the sun. There's no trees or obstructions to it to the south, so it is a very good spot for this kind of a vegetation and garden. The soil was nothing special, and we did nothing to amend it before we planted the plants. And all the gardens that we did at the Arboretum, we have done with plants, not with seeding. So in that way, it's a lot different from the restoration scale work that we heard about last time. And this is the Friends of the Arboretum Terrace Garden. This is to the north of the visitor center. And you can see here, it was really just a construction zone at the time. It was the first garden to go in as far as the herbaceous plants go. And you can see it, just the new flagstones, the new path, a lot of impervious surface there. But the plants were just planted in. You can see some flags back here. This was done prior to my being there, so I just know this from the records, that they did a little top dressing of the construction soil, which was a very, very heavy clay. Had been run over with machines and everything, very, very heavy. And then they did use some wood chip mulch here. I've never used wood chip mulch on the herbaceous plants there, but in this case they did. And then a couple years later, this is what the garden looked like here on the right. You can see a lot of different species. Of course, they were planted according to a diagram, according to a plan that Daryl drew out, and this is the result. So in a case like this, it was just kind of bare soil to start with, because it had just recently been constructed. And each site is unique. So every site will have, every garden, every yard will have different areas within it. Every site from yard to yard can be different. The positioning of the slopes, or the position, or the way that water flows through the site makes for a lot of differences. And then, so always with this matching here, a lot of these plants are suited to a moist, it was inspired by a wet prairie, actually. So a lot of them do well in a moist area, like the blue joint grass back here. There's irises, etc. This garden gets water coming across it from the roof, and I'll talk about the rain garden that's associated with this later, but the clay soil and water passing across this makes this garden a little more moist than you'd otherwise expect from just seeing how it is out in the middle of sun and sometimes quite dry. So one of the first questions that I get is how to deal with the small spaces. And people say, oh, I love the prairie plants. They're beautiful, they're gorgeous, but they're just too big and they'll flop around. And I just don't know how to handle all that bigness in my smaller spaces. So we have some areas where we try to help people see how native plants could be used in a shorter stature garden. One of the examples is the garden, if you've been to the Arboretum, the one right out in front of the visitor center, there's a circle out in the middle of the pavement. And that one is fairly short stature. We're supposed to keep it short for safety reasons because of the drive, pedestrians and the cars and everything. The UW police like to have it up like knee high or so, but that garden is a good example of one where you can look at the species in there. Generally, it stays shorter. We've had a lot of tall grass seed into it from the prairie, and with that, we simply cut it back and weaken them. Just like cut them down to we don't let them seed, and we cut them down, the big bunch grasses, and that's generally successful. You do have to keep on top of it, but that's generally how we do it. And we can do it because we're on a small scale. And I have a lot of helpers. For the most part, I have 50 to 60 volunteers per year that are working in the garden, a couple of students. Well, we didn't have it last year and we won't have it this year, but when things change again, we'll be returning to having more volunteers on the land and helping with those things and learning along the way. So this planting right here is a short grass planting. It has the 4 native short grasses, the June grass, little blue stem, side oats, grama, and the which one did I leave out? Drop seed. So we have those grasses planted there, and then we have a few accents, and you can see, I don't know if you can see this tiny little harebells here. There are some black-eyed Susans in there. There's prairie smoke. So at different times of year, different small forbs are coming up through this, through the grasses. And the grasses kind of change in dominance over time. The June grass kind of fades out. It's not as competitive. It likes disturbance. If we don't make disturbance and create that, it doesn't persist as long. But otherwise, it's a pretty interesting mix, and you can see it's fairly short, even compared to the dry mesic area, which is just beyond. And these are some examples of the little plants that can go into there: the prairie smoke, shooting star, and the June grass and prairie phlox. These are growing well on well-drained soils. Usually we use them in rock gardens as well, or sunny gravel kind of gardens. In our front garden at the Arboretum, our lime prairie garden, we have these growing as well. And just a note about a short garden: it's going to perhaps have more weed pressure because there's more sun getting to the ground. And that's, and so especially at the beginning, when it has been disturbed soil to start with, and you're putting, especially if you're using plants, they're going to be spread out more, there'll be more open space. So that is just something, kind of a trade-off. For shorter gardens might mean a little more weeding, a little more care. On the other hand, they have a little more open space, so they do renew, some of those plants can take advantage of that, and less competition for sunlight, so they can persist. And if you pack the plants into a small space, or use your seeds from those plants right away to fill in those empty spaces, you'll be in good shape. We start with planting our plants about a foot on center, so a foot apart from everything, from the others. but you can do it a little closer than that, or you can plant them at that distance and then continue to add seed to get a little more density. And this is another short area in the more shady spot. So I have woodland phlox, Sprengale sedge in bloom at the same time as the phlox. So it's an early blooming sedge. There's bishop's cap in here. There's wild geranium. I think we also have some alum root in this planting. This is in a semi-shaded edge. It's fairly dry there, but the sedge is a shade-loving sedge. So it does a beautiful job, and there's kind of not really a ground cover, but just a nice even but nicely textured bed. And it can be a little more mesic or dry mesic location. Sometimes people are asking about what can I put in the shade, even if it's a little bit dry. Not deep shade, but edge kind of shade or dapple shade. And then other plants that are still kind of staying short enough for this would be the example of the butterfly weed or butterfly milkweed, which comes in these different shades of orange and some up to coral color and a little more of this red. And it's paired here with the white sage, and white sage would not be a short plant, a plant that I would really encourage you to plant in a bed if it has a lot of open space, because it is a very prolific plant. When it starts out, it just takes over everything. It looks very well behaved in this picture, but it isn't always that well behaved at first. So it's one of the plants that does very well at the beginning, very well in open space, very well under disturbance, and then it kind of settles down and intermingles with other plants more like this. But do be careful about it, because I think I would advise, if you were planting it for this kind of color contrast or like that you plant everything else first and then maybe put one in somewhere to keep it from getting out of hand. This is a silky aster, and this is a small aster, about maybe 18 inches tall. The flowers are quite large. They're about an inch across. So it's got a lot of color. It's got these wiry little stems, grayish green leaves, attracts a lot of the pollinators, of course. And this one is good for dry mesic sites. Both of these photos would be showing up well in dry or dry mesic sites. And also for that a little bit later blooming color and pollinator benefit. And then in your mesic and wet mesic sites, the red milkweed is not exactly a short plant, but it's a real favorite. And everyone, I think people don't mind a tall plant if they like how it looks. So it is of course, important for monarchs, favored for monarchs, and then every other insect visitor who visits it it will be clustered on this plant. Bottle gentian is more of a specialist pollinator plant. So this was pollinated by bumblebees, and this is the flower in full bloom. This one right here is probably actively blooming right now. These here that are a different color have actually already been pollinated, and they're developing their fruits within. The bee has to force its way in there. The pleats of the petals come apart. The bee goes in and the pleats close up again. And then when the bee's ready to come out, it can just force its way out. So this one's for wet areas, wet mesic areas, wet mesic, I would say, would be the ideal habitat for it. The deer love it. So I like to have this one growing with other things around it so that the deer can't quite find it as easily. And this is a late summer blooming one, and the milkweed is more of a midsummer. So around your house and around your garden, I really want to point out that you've got more habitats than you think you do, because you've got microclimates. And this is an example along our building, the north side of our visitor center. This small oak tree when we first planted the understory, we planted the geraniums, the golden alexanders, and the columbines. And you can see they're doing quite well. There's other plants coming up here that are going to be the next, the next plants to be thriving in this area. But what you can't see is that just behind this group of plants, there's a downspout that comes down. And so right behind here, there's a whole clump of bellwort. And bellwort is a forest. We think of it as a forest plant more. It is a savanna, it's in the savanna flora, but the fact that it's growing there is because it's really close to the building, the north side of the building. So the microclimate there is just good enough for it to thrive. And if I had planted it out further out here by where the columbine is, it would not be doing well at all. Maybe a few sprigs would come up each year, but they wouldn't thrive. And that's a big difference just over a matter of feet. And you have that kind of thing to work with when you're working around a building, north side of the building, or with downspouts involved. So keep that in mind, because it can be quite helpful to have more places to plant things than you want. If something isn't doing well in one spot, maybe it needs to move to another spot, and you can really move these plants pretty readily. Don't be too shy about that either. Sometimes they won't make it where you put them, but sometimes they'll show some sign of life, and you'll know that you could put them in a better spot. Another question I get is around the words like wild. These gardens look so wild. They look messy. They are out of control. And I've gotten over those kinds of complaints or those kinds of comments, but it is something to consider, because we're not gardening in a vacuum. We want our gardens to communicate that we're caring for them, that they're intentional, that they are important, that they have value. And we know some of the value that they have. We know they are more valuable in some ways than a lawn that looks great and is under control and doesn't look messy. So I guess what I would phrase this section on is, how can your garden look appealing and intentional while still being very naturalistic and very true to the inspiration that you're using to create it? And so the idea of cues to care, and this is a phrase that was introduced and made and has been written about by Joan Nassauer. And what she means by cues to care is that there are ways to signal that this garden is intentional, that this garden is cared for, and that this garden is valuable. And so an example here from this is a picture of our Black Oak Savanna garden in the early years. And this, you can see that the lawn, there's a curved boundary on it, but the lawn is clipped up, and this looks like a garden bed. So we have the lawn, as most people have some lawn at least, and then there is a bed, and that is what is intentional about it. And keeping just simple clues like that make a big difference. I have a neighborhood association now that has decided that we shouldn't have prairie lawns in our neighborhood, but I can do this right up to practically the edge of the property. So these are things that just keep in mind. You are communicating, you're enjoying your own yard, you're creating it, but you're also communicating with it. And another example would be here, we have this is Monarda out of control. I mean, but this is what Monarda looks like when you have an area where you've put in quite a few plants. You think, well, that's all that's there. It is not, but at the time that this was blooming and at the early stages of this garden planting, the Monarda was very exuberant. And so one way to handle that in a neighborhood or in an area where you're going to be communicating with people while you're not out there, is to use small interpretive signs. And there's lots of these available. Wild Ones has them. The Xerces Society put this one out a few years ago, but they have a new one now that's gorgeous. So might be worth looking into that. And it just, a little explanation. This is intentional. And then the other part of this is just person to person, talking with people, sharing your garden with people. Here's some children from day camp at the Arboretum. I think we were doing a root collecting exercise there, which was to look at different root systems along a continuum, taproot to fibrous root. They were meanwhile weeding out the terrace there on the Friends Terrace. This is a group of adult volunteers out collecting seed and learning what kind of seed, how to collect it, when to collect it, and gathering it. And then what you can do with this at home, if you usually have plenty of seed after an exercise like this, is you can share some of those seeds with people. Sometimes the plants will automatically share them for you to your neighbor's yard, but this is a good way to explain to people, oh, here are some seeds. Did you like that plant? Oh, here are some seeds for it. Here's what I suggest you grow it, and da da da. And that can be very powerful as well. Moving on to water and rain gardens. This is just a topic which is very timely because we are seeing so much more heavy rain. This is our wet mesic prairie garden, and you can see a lot of variety here, a lot of diversity in the forms and the colors. This is our front rain garden. So all the rain off of this roof right here comes down through a downspout, or rather a drain, and comes down into this garden here. So when we first planted it, and then a couple years later, it looks like this. So you have quite a diversity of plants. We have the angelica here in full seed, the red milkweed that I pointed out before, boneset. There's irises, et cetera, et cetera. We had cattails that came up there on their own. They weren't invited, but we found that with cattails on this scale, if you just cut them repeatedly in about 3-week interval, they disappear. They don't come back. So that's a easy method of getting rid of cattails with no herbicide or anything involved. This is our large rain garden, and this one has, you won't be working on the scale at home probably. This is 30 meters across from the basin here. That was a created basin when the construction was done for the visitor center, but it receives the water from about half of the visitor center, and you're looking at about half of the visitor center here. So half of the visitor center on this side drains into this. This is what it looks like in the summer. A lot of variety again, so this midsummer, and a lot more color and movement and noise in the late summer. The Joe Pye weed, the sweet black-eyed Susan, there's milkweed in there. There's some thistles, native thistles. And then late summer, getting a little quieter now with the last blooming showy goldenrod, Riddell's goldenrod, New England aster, frost aster, etc. So what are we want to see that color, movement, and noise, but we also know that these are processes that were created because these plants have come together, because we brought them together, because we've managed them, managed the garden, I mean, and learned how to manage it along the way. A lot of this is just learning as you go. But pollination is one of the processes there. Species interactions, how many pollinators can fit on a button bush head, and predation, of course, food webs, all very important things that are put into motion with this kind of garden. You may be familiar with Douglas Tallamy's latest book. This was last year. It came out about a year ago. he has also, besides his books, he has online talks. And when you see his online talks, you can just be treated to a wonderful series of all of the caterpillars that are supported by the native. He has a lot of native trees that he has described the caterpillar fauna and how that supports the bird, songbird fauna. So those are some things that you might want to look for in his, while we're still overwintering here. You might want to look into some of those photo talks that he has. They're just amazing. And there's lots of interdependencies that will be before your eyes. Of course, the monarchs laying their eggs on the milkweed supplying nectar and nourishment for so many floral visitors, as well as for the larvae of the monarch. The bumblebees that are visiting the flowers, that are carrying the pollen of the milkweed. That's what we see here on the legs and the mandibles of this bee, the golden northern bee. And then, of course, the flowers that the monarch will need prior to migrating. So all of these things fitting together are also coming together in your garden, and something that you wouldn't see. You might know about it in your head, but you wouldn't really keep learning more and more about this interconnected nature. So the things that I'm going to go through really quick here are just some general principles. Maximize the number and diversity of native plants in your landscape. So pack them in there. If you have a plant that looks like, it's either non-native and you notice it's just basically not serving any, there's nobody eating it, there's nobody living in it, there's nobody using it, no critters using it, maybe replace that one with something else. And Talame's book is helpful in that regard when it comes to trees and shrubs. Get a seasonal succession of flowering and varied flower forms. So you have all the different types of flowers, different representatives of different families. And then when it comes time in the fall for seeding, you'll see different seeds being produced, and different animals are using those different seeds. So all these things, the flowers are going to give the fruits, give the seeds. So all, again, part of those interconnected relationships. I recommend planting straight species. I've seen a lot of cultivars, and I've seen some diminutive cultivars of large plants, and people think, oh, that'd be perfect, it's small. But it turns out that in that process of the cultivar, developing the cultivar and producing it, it just isn't as valuable ecologically or biologically. So keep that in mind. This is out at the Baptisia demonstration garden, and you can see this is the native Baptisia alba, and this is one of the cultivars or types of Baptisia that's growing out there. You can see what uses them, you can make some comparisons with that, or you can check the literature. There are studies now of cultivars versus straight species, but I really stick with the straight species being a native plant gardener. You want to avoid pesticides, especially in systemic insecticides. These are chemicals that plants are treated with in production sometimes, and the pesticide remains in the plant, in the tissues as the plant grows. It's soluble in water, so it gets into the soils, it gets into waterways. This is a very serious issue. These are from a native plant nursery here, so they'll be proud to tell you that there's no systemic insecticides involved in their production, and you should be looking for that for your other plants as well. Keep a little bit wilder. This is the section where my volunteers say, oh, so you're telling me I don't have to work so hard. Yes, keep logs, keep rocks, keep some rock piles, maybe have some buffer areas if you can that are a little bit wilder. Avoid using landscape fabric or rocks for mulch. Instead, plant the plants densely, keep them tight. Heavy wood chip mulch would be the same basically as using landscape fabric or rock. So people ask me about that. A thin layer of mulch won't prevent plants from establishing or from plants from growing, but thick mulch is just like having a fabric. And leave the plant material standing over the winter. You could trim it in the spring or rake it off. A lot of times it's just raking it off. In some cases, you might have a situation where you could burn it, depending on your situation. If you can do it safely and legally, there's that option. We do burn usually our rain gardens at the Arboretum and then some of our other gardens on rotation. So they're small areas, but our crew surrounds them and has them burned in no time. This is the winter panorama of that same area. And then document, and this is part of the sharing, but find out what you have there. We came upon documenting the rusty patch bumblebee completely by accident in our garden. It was discovered there, and then we began to follow up on that. So that's just something that I know from personal experience you can always count on. Whatever questions you have, whatever interests you have, go ahead and follow those. And if you have bumblebee pictures, this is my one plug for pollinators. Send your bumblebee photos to Bumblebee Brigade, and they have a lot of resources there. So while you're overwintering, just like the bumblebee queens are, go ahead to that website and see what you can learn for participating next year. My thanks to Arboretum folks and all the volunteers and the bumblebee monitors, the experts, and everyone promoting sustainable gardening. Our funding comes from the Wisconsin Native Plant Garden Fund at the UW Foundation through the Arboretum, and the Wisconsin DNR Citizen-Based Monitoring Program has supported us for some of the pollinator work. Just a last slide for questions is the Friends of the Arboretum does have a plant sale going this year. It is not the tent sale, it is online. So it's going to be curbside pickup, and this is the website for FOA, Friends of Arboretum Madison.org screenshot, and you've got all the pictures and all the ways to filter your site and a lot of plants available. So take a look at that if you're interested, if you want to get further along in native plant gardening, start with it, or just grab a few plants. So thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Susan. And now we would love to open it up to questions. If anybody has questions, how about I invite you to put those into the chat box, and then Micah and I can moderate and we will pitch those to Susan. While people are typing their questions as they come up, I will just share that this is my it's 2 years in a row now, my birthday present from my mom is a bunch of plants from the Friends of Arboretum, or Friends of the Arboretum plant sale.
Oh, that's
putting in my order shortly.
That's great.
All right, here's a question from Jean. What type of plants do the rusty patch bumblebees like?
Wow, that's a great question. And there is actually, because they're federally endangered now, that listing went, got official in 2017. The Fish and Wildlife Service has a website and a web area completely devoted to the rusty patch bumblebee. And we put together, some years ago, we put together a list of plants that were their special favorites. So if you go to, if you just Google rusty patch bumblebee endangered and Fish and Wildlife, maybe it'll come right up. And there's a whole page of different information from land managers, gardeners, etc. And there'll be a link to a plant list there. The rusty patch is not a picky bumblebee. In my experience, it likes a lot of the same plants that the general group of bumblebees like. There are a few bumblebee species which are quite different from the main ones. We have about 12 species of bumblebees here in southern Wisconsin. So from my experience, a few of them are more particular to certain species, but the rusty patch is kind of a generalist. So the best ones early in the season, a lot of the flowering shrubs would be good because the flowering cherries, flowering members of like prunus. In the summer, they love Culver's root, they love Monarda, they love, let's see what else. They'll go on shooting stars in the early spring. Let's see, kind of, they'll go on the goldenrods, they'll go on the asters. They're pretty general. So that list takes you through, it has species from the spring all the way to the fall, and you can just follow along. And if you grow those plants, you'll also be attracting about 8 or so of the other bumblebee species. And so you'll be in good shape for seeing bumblebees. And the best way I can say to identify them is to take pictures of them and start to get to know them through tracking them with a camera and looking for the details. So, and I went from knowing nothing about bumblebees, and I'm feeling pretty comfortable about recognizing them now. So I know anyone can do it.
Great, thank you. How about any recommendations that you might share with us about must-have reference books?
Okay, that's a great question too. Well, I think interestingly that looking to the ecological books is more helpful for my way of thinking for native plant gardening than looking to the horticulture books. So there are a lot of, I mean, some of the native plant nurseries have a lot of good information. There's plant finder websites where you can type in your zip code and a list of natives from that area, you know, that would apply to your area will come up. That doesn't quite tell you what goes on your site, but it does give you the flora. But I actually, Vegetation of Wisconsin is so helpful when you're taking a plant community approach like our garden is. Each garden area is based on a native plant community. So we don't have every plant from that plant community, but we have the essence of it. That's the way Daryl describes the design process. So we know, and if someone calls me and says, oh, I've got this kind of site and I'm up north, my first go-to is to that book, because I'm looking for the dry site. I'm, you know, they're told me it's a dry site, or they tell me it's sandy, they tell me it's this, and I can, you know, I can piece together from that. So it's a kind of technical book in a way. I mean, you know, I'm a botanist, so I like it. The other one that I really love, and this is a book that you should impress upon your library to get because it's about 4 inches thick, is the Flora of the Chicago region, because that book lists all the plants, and a lot of them of the Chicago region also apply to southern Wisconsin. It lists all the plants alphabetically by genus, but it lists them with the plants that they grow with. So you look up, say you look up wild columbine here, and it says in, you know, dry prairies, wild columbine, and then it lists all the plant, it lists its associates. So if you know a plant that you have growing or that you've seen growing and you want to know what grows with it, you can go to that book and find it. It's a, you know, it's a pretty expensive book and it's not commonly available, but it would be the kind of thing you wouldn't use it every day, but you would want to sit down maybe sometime with it from the library and look at what, you know, and look up some plants that way. It's quite helpful. I think we have a copy in our Arboretum library, so I know we have the previous version, which is still just as good. So, yeah.
Wonderful. All right, here's a good question about some garden management techniques from Brooke. She's heard that some tall plants can be trimmed early in the season to keep them shorter and more tidy, and then they'll still bloom. Do you recommend this option? And she's thinking in particular of species like New England aster, penstemon, marsh milkweed, and showy goldenrod.
Yeah, it's that can be very tricky. And so I'm going to encourage, I can give her a little bit of information about that. I can tell her some things that won't work from that I've learned just from trying it, but otherwise try it. For plants that have a determinate flowering, so like Monarda is an example. I haven't had much luck with like trimming Monarda when it's younger and then having it bloom. You can trim it and it still has leaves and everything, but with a plant like New England aster, yes, just trim it when it's smaller, you know, as it's getting big. You can trim it and it'll bush out and it will still bloom because it's blooming very, very late. Showy goldenrod. I bet that one might be similar, but I'm not going to say for sure, because it could be that that the flower, the part about the blooming is already determined. I mean, I know that if you damage the bud of it, it can branch and still go, or like you've seen Canada goldenrod where the galls, where, flower gall has gotten onto the top of it, and then it'll still put these weird like flowering things out, which I don't think is quite the look you may be looking for. But it depends. So I guess the answer is it depends. It depends on whether the plant, when you're trimming it in its development, and also whether that plant has kind of already determined the flowering in the part that you're trimming off. So experiment with it and let me know what you find out, because there's hundreds of species to try that on. And I know it'll work with New England aster. Milkweed, I'm not sure about. I'm not sure. That would be an interesting question.
Brooke, you can try it and report back to us.
Yes, report back, please.
All right, I see two more questions here. One is kind of a sourcing question in terms of questions to ask vendors. What would you recommend asking vendors to make sure that we're not introducing jumping worms or other undesirable hitchhiking species when you're buying these plugs?
Yeah, jumping worms, you just got to ask. And if they say they don't know, or they say, our practices are all completely good, we don't, but you can look at the plants and see. I would encourage you, if you're buying plants that are in pots, I would encourage you to, to ask about how they were propagated. Were they propagated on the ground? And, and has there been any infestation? Most of the businesses are supposed to be certified that they are free of jumping worms. That was supposed to happen, but I don't think that's been happening really. The trouble with jumping worms early in the season when you're buying the plants is they're cocoons at that point. There's not many that are adults at that point. We're just seeing evidence now that some may overwinter, as there could still be adults in protected areas or something. But mostly if you just take soil from an area that has jumping worms, and it may just be the cocoons within the soil, and you wouldn't necessarily spot those very easily because they're very small and you have to know exactly what you're looking for. But those would be hatching throughout the season because their life cycle is more of an annual life cycle. I'm just oversimplify it a bit, but they hatch, they grow. And so the most you'll see in an area that's infested will be late in the season when they've really come up to maturity. And so early in the season, not so much. I would be wary of, if places are doing greenhouse propagation and they're up on, stands, and they're using potting soil that's not, been composted, or, laying in they're using clean potting soil, I would think you're in pretty good shape for that. You don't want to the Arboretum, when we were having our plant sale, we don't set the pots, we don't store the pots on the ground anymore. I mean, we just don't, because we were just worried that worms could come up into the pots. The worms can climb kind of like if you have pots that you think they're up, but you think they're safe, but the worms can move move quite a bit if they want to. So I would caution you not to store them. If you're concerned that you have jumping worms, there are ways to find out if you do. And if you're sharing plants with people, you should absolutely not do that anymore if you have an infestation, just to keep it from spreading. Or if you have plants at your home which may be infested and you're moving them to your property which may not be infested, I would really argue against that too. I'm very careful about that with my land. I just basically use seed there. You can bare root plants, and then that's safe. So if you order plants bare root, and that works for you, you can pot them yourself, or you can store them yourself. That's legitimate. You won't have a problem with jumping worms then. So bare root is one way to go if that's a possibility.
I've got these mental images now of jumping worms jumping into potted plants.
Well, they kind of, yeah, I don't know. They can get they can get places.
Yes, jumping worms. All right, a couple more questions here. One from Tracy, who's asking if there's a resource that tells you what native plants historically lived in or on an area.
Yeah, that again, the site, of course, it depends on the site, but in a region, the vegetation of Wisconsin will help you with that, or some of the historical maps. That said, for example, I have some conservation land, and we have a we have a bluff. So it has north, south, east, and west. And the vegetation on the north side is entirely different from the south side, obviously, because of the different microclimates, basically, or the slopes and aspects there. So with that in mind, our north side has a lot of like Pleistocene, it has some Pleistocene relic species, and on the south side it's a dry prairie. So keep in mind that just because the region was, had a certain amount of prairie, oak savanna, etc. I think it's more important maybe to read the land that's there now, and what does it look like it was, what kind of vegetation was it? Is it an overgrown old savanna? Was it a dry prairie that's now, been brushed in? That kind of thing, and make your changes from that. Our yards and our in town and, in the city and so forth are highly disturbed. So that's why when I say matching the site, we're talking really about like a shady north side of the house or a slope. The plants are resilient, but they do, they're going to need to be a little bit, they're going to need to be matched. Let me put it that way. I don't know if that answered the question. If you have, if anyone has questions that go into more and want to go into more depth, feel free to email me too at the Arboretum. My email is readily available there, and I'm glad to answer any more detailed questions or more more particular to your situation.
That's generous. Thank you, Susan. All right, one last question for this evening. That is from Beth, who's got big blue stem growing in a short grass prairie area. She's been told or recommended to plant wood betony to control the big blue, and she's wondering, will that hurt her short grass species?
That's a great question. We have areas that I have big blue stem, as I mentioned, I think in the talk. I have areas where big blue stem has seeded into an area, and we burn that area quite often. Almost every year we burn that parking lot prairie, and so that actually stimulates those tall grasses. So we've taken to just scalping them at the ground. And I don't mean just trimming off the leaf, trimming them up high. I mean, right at the ground as low as we can. You do that a couple of times, they'll come back, but then we do that a couple of times. It's kind of like grazing it down as far as you can. And that has helped. I would try the betony for sure. But it might decrease the other grasses too. That's possibility. I would try it in an area where you've got mostly big blue stem and see if it will, if it will work on that and maybe not on the other grasses. That's a very interesting question, and report back on that one for sure.
Indeed.
Another one that we've had that's had the same effect. So if it's not, if it's suitable, is the northern bed straw, because that one it forms. It's a hemiparasitic plant, form an association to grasses, to some of the. That might be another one to try.
Good recommendations. All right, and speaking of reporting back, we've got one last observation from my mom.
Good.
We've got some relevant intel to the question about trimming plants, tall plants during the season, and she can report that she has trimmed swamp milkweed and also ironweed, presumably early in the season,
Uh-huh.
and has succeeded in getting them,
Okay.
preventing them from getting tall.
So they bloomed at a shorter height then? Okay,
Yes.
good. I think it's going to be in the timing, because once those buds are set, then it might, you know, the plant might have said, okay, we did that this year already, and now you lost out. But great, that's good to know. Thanks, Karen.
Good crowdsourcing happening.
Yeah, right. Everyone send in your pruning information.
Yep. All right, good. Well, let's wrap up and leave it there. Susan, I want to thank you again. What a wonderful and informative presentation tonight. I really enjoyed it. And I'm so glad that all of you joined us. So thank you for sharing your time with us on this cold evening. I hope that everybody stays warm and stays well. And I hope that you can join us in 2 weeks. Thank you very much. Good night, everybody.
Good night.